Good. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's talk on What's the Point of DHS, which is hosted by the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law. My name is Stephanie Loiter, and I'm the Director of the Central America and Mexico Policy Initiative at the Strauss Center. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Ben Rohrbaugh. Ben is a fellow in the Strauss Center's Central America and Mexico Policy Initiative, and he is the co-founder of Lantern UAS, which develops autonomous systems for supply chain security. From 2014 to 2016, Ben served as the Director for Enforcement and Border Security at the National Security Council in the White House. And before the White House, Ben worked as a senior advisor to the Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Importantly, and serving as a basis of this talk, Ben is also the author of the new book, More or Less Afraid of, you see it? No, you can't, okay. More or Less Afraid of Nearly Everything, Homeland Security, Borders, and Disaster in the 21st Century. We're so lucky to have Ben with us today. But before we begin, I want to just quickly remind you all to please put your questions in the Q&A chat function. I'll read them to Ben after he wraps up his presentation. Thanks again for joining us, and Ben, the floor is yours.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you everyone for joining us today to talk about Homeland Security, disasters, and really other great topics to bring up in any kind of social event or setting where you may want to win friends and influence people. So today I'm going to talk about an important question, which is what is the point of DHS? And this is the sort of fundamental question that my book, More or Less Afraid of Nearly Everything, is about. We'll soon reach 2 decades since the Department of Homeland Security was created. And more and more frequently, the question is arising. Why did we do this reorganization? And was it a good idea? Was this all just sort of a reaction to 9/11 or an overreaction and something that should be wound down? And so sort of the bottom line up front, I do think there's a point to DHS and that the establishment of the department has important lessons that go sort of far beyond its missions. And I'll explain why today, but the fundamental point is that non-state risks, the kind of threats that the US government's security functions weren't created to address, are increasingly challenging the ability of government to respond. And DHS was, in this analysis, really just sort of the first step in responding to these, the first sort of reorganization and change in structure and strategy to deal with what are new threats that the government isn't well organized to deal with. But before I get to that, I'll start by acknowledging that the cases against DHS can be quite compelling. DHS is very unpopular. The department has been in the center of some of the worst political controversies of the Trump administration, from family separation at the border to response to protests in Oregon and in other places. Prominent mainstream figures have called for the department to be disbanded. People from former Senator Barbara Boxer, who was involved in the department being established, to President Obama's former Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes. And within government, DHS is pretty unpopular. A lot of other agencies, other more established agencies, tend to resent what they perceive as its incursions into their territory and their missions. I worked at the National Security Council. Most of the people at the National Security Council are detailed from other places, and the majority of them come from places like state or CIA, where there's this very established organizational cultures and clear hierarchies. And for most of them, DHS was something they didn't want to deal with. It was something that it was messy, and it was seen as immature and incompetent. And now it's been particularly seen as tainted by the Trump administration. And I think for people who come from organizations that are much more functional, and where when you work at a place like state or CIA, you're working with lots of people who are very motivated and who have worked their way up through competitive hierarchies. And people are generally very well credentialed. And the sort of easiest question to ask when you're dealing with DHS is sort of like, why can't they get it together? Why is this, they're just either ill prepared for meetings or incompetent or other things. And sort of, meanwhile, at the same time, the spirit of the time, the urgency that drove the establishment of the department, which was, of course, the frantic aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, is basically gone. The threat of spectacular mass casualty attacks by a group like Al-Qaeda or similar organizations has certainly receded from public attention. And the most consequential decision that was made at the same time as the establishment of DHS, which was, of course, the decision to invade Iraq, the Iraq War, it was made by the same people largely who determined how DHS would be created, has been totally discredited. Now it's almost universally seen as a mistake and a disaster. And so at the same time, as now we're seeing, particularly through COVID, American civilians have never been, are more vulnerable than they've been at any point in recent history. We're of course seeing, it is affecting the format of this talk. We are seeing sort of staggering levels of disruption and sickness and death, while the government has largely flailed in response. And the fear and insecurity becomes sort of pervasive in the very homeland that DHS was created to secure. And so finally, on top of all this, as I finish the case against DHS, DHS itself seems often fairly confused about what it is and what it should be doing. Under the Trump administration, it's been all migration all the time. It's been all border security. But the department actually has incredibly broad missions, and the entities that are part of it do all kinds of very, very different things, from dignitary protection of the Secret Service to emergency response to FEMA, through activities of the Coast Guard and the littorals. I mean, it's really incredibly broad, and the department, because of that, has really struggled to articulate its strategy. And so you see this in particular in the department's mission statement, which is, I'll quote it here: "With honor and integrity, we safeguard the American people, our homeland, and our values," end quote. And so that's, it's a very nice sentiment, but that could be the mission statement of an insurance company. It doesn't really give you a sense of what the department does, especially when you compare it to like Department of Defense, where they say, our mission statement, our mission is to provide the military forces needed to deter war and protect the security of our country. I mean, that's clear if you know what the department does, even if you have differences with the way they do it. So given all this, it is fair to ask, what is the point of the Department of Homeland Security? Could we disband it and not have to worry about all these problems that seem to come up around the department and the department presents? And so my answer is no. And I think my take is a little bit different than what is often seen, in particularly in progressive political circles where I operate. I was an 8-year appointee of the Obama administration. So I think there was a point to creating DHS. And the point is that national security is no longer something that just happens in other countries, which was largely the American experience in the 20th century. There are a group of emerging threats. People use different terms. I'll describe them as either emerging threats or non-state threats in particular, that are putting civilians and their interests directly at risk in ways that, at a scale that previously was really only associated with foreign militaries. And our national security and law enforcement structures and strategies are very ill-suited to respond to this group of threats. And I'll go through them in detail. The United States is very well organized now to respond to national security threats that come from foreign governments, particularly foreign militaries. We're well organized to conduct international intelligence operations and counterintelligence operations. And we're, again, very well organized to pursue foreign policy advantage against other foreign nation states. But we're not well organized to respond to non-state threats. And I think the changes are going to continue. And really, in my analysis, DHS is really just sort of the first step in adapting to this, and the beginning of an adaptation that we'll see across government. I think we can either make these changes intentionally and in advance of crises that we know are going to come, or we can wait until the crisis manifests and then make decisions about how our strategies need to change and how these structures need to be adapted in the sort of frantic environment following those crises, which is obviously a worse way to do that. And I think this is particularly urgent right now because DHS was an example of the kind of decisions that are made in the aftermath of a crisis, and we're in another crisis that will likely result in major changes to government, of course, through COVID, where we could have either some new cabinet department, we could have some new cabinet secretary type official who's put in charge of pandemic response, and really could see significant changes that should be informed by the lessons of the experience we've had with the Department of Homeland Security. So to me, the question is not, why did we create this? Why is DHS around? How can we go back to the structure we had before? But is instead, with the staggering resources that we put into national security, why are civilians increasingly vulnerable? How do we need to change our strategy and reorganize our government in order to do so? And what did we do right in establishing DHS, and what did we do wrong? So Now I'll go into a little bit more detail about what I mean when I'm talking about these threats. What are sort of these specific things that I think have become so unmanageable for government, and why we haven't been effective at addressing them so far. So the backdrop on all of this is that non-state actors, entities, either companies, but particularly groups like organized criminal groups or terrorist groups or other things like that, have become much more potent than they previously were. And the key driver has been technological change. And so as the groups that I'll articulate are disease. We'll talk through infectious disease and how that is challenging government. We'll talk through the changes in terrorism and how terrorist threats have been very difficult for the government to adapt to, although we've certainly gone through more adaptation since the 9/11 attacks in this area than in others. We'll talk about organized crime, why this has been particularly challenging. Talk about natural disasters, and then talk through cybersecurity, and then finally weapons of mass destruction. So these 6 areas, they're not all organizations, but they all are connected by the fact that they're increasingly empowering either non-state actors or non-state forces that are challenging government. So first, beginning with infectious disease, this is the most obvious one. It wasn't when I was writing the book in 2018 and 2019, but the key point I'll put across here about the COVID crisis and what we've seen is that COVID is a national security disaster. It's not something that maybe causes second-order national security disasters. It's something that is directly killing American civilians. And this really needs to be emphasized because I think when we have a public discussion about national security, it's so informed by the 20th century experience and the specific kind of actions and threats that we dealt with in the 20th century, where there was this threat of an annihilating nuclear war, and everything was framed around this national security structure, that we don't tend to think of pandemic disease as something national security. But to me, in this analysis, something that is directly killing thousands of Americans a day is something that is absolutely needs to be treated with the same urgency that we would treat the Russians coming through West Germany, and is gonna and needs the same level of structural change that any other national security disaster would require. And so I think when we think about future pandemic disease threats, and we know we expect that there will be major changes as a result of this experience, but I think it's important to consider that they could be very different from the experience we're having in COVID and the way they manifest. And so they're basically, we know there could be other respiratory diseases, things like other SARS variations or something, different kinds of novel influenza. And this is something that we have sort of the most direct experience with through H1N1 and through currently COVID. But there could be other kinds of manifestations, and particularly it could be groups of fluid contact diseases, things more like Ebola or other kind of Marburg or Hendra Lassa. And then you could have vector transmitted diseases where things where they're transmitted by fleas or mosquitoes or other kinds of pests, and all of these would result in very different pandemic experiences. Right now we're obviously focused on masks and public health and the way these can be transmitted through small areas, but a comparably alarming pandemic driven by mosquitoes would have just totally different consequences in the way we would conduct our daily lives and the way we would deal with everything. So I think that the key point is just that variations in how viruses transmit can have enormous impacts in how we structure ourselves. And the reason that the federal government has had so much trouble in responding to this, aside from the specific pathologies of the Trump administration, is that the federal role in pandemic response is largely either funding research through the National Institutes of Health or BARDA or other entities like that, or it's coordinating among entities that it doesn't directly control. And so this is something when I was in the White House during Ebola response, and we saw that suddenly we were trying to coordinate across all kinds of different state, local, tribal, private entities, and that structure works well under sort of normal conditions, but when you have a national threat, it's very, very hard using the systems that exist now to coordinate a national response. And so even the pandemic plan that the Obama administration left for the Trump administration, which was certainly much better than the course of action that the Trump administration pursued at the beginning of the pandemic, but was fundamentally like a White House-driven strategy, which is what you have when you don't have good structures in place within government. Whenever you have the White House having to drive something, when they have to go in and coordinate across lots of different entities, that means that there isn't effective, there aren't effective ways to deal with it in place. So I'll move on now to the threat of terrorism and how this is changing and why this has been so difficult for government as well. And this is the one that we've gone through the most adaptation to. But I think that the fundamental shift we've seen and the fundamental alarming change that has driven the way that government has adapted has been the shift from what we call sort of 20th century nation state driven terrorism to 21st century terrorism, which is much, much greater in scale, much more threatening, and where people really seek much more spectacular devastation. And I think the experience of 20th century terrorism was largely groups acting for control of a nation state or acting in competition with other groups for control of the nation states. And so there were certainly horrifying attacks, and certainly, certainly it could be incredibly dangerous for civilians, but there wasn't the kind of massive attacks motivated by rejection of the modern world that we certainly see through Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other entities that are similar to those. And I think that there's a very important distinction between the way we think about 20th century terrorism and 21st century terrorism that needs to be drawn, because 21st century terrorism, groups that really have the characteristics of these transnational organizations, really need a very different approach. And I think we saw this when in the aftermath of 9/11, when major changes were taken throughout the counterterrorism enterprise, where there are very well documented failures of information sharing across the federal government, particularly with the FBI and the CIA, that certainly could have stopped the attacks. And then particularly, there were failures where the Immigration and Naturalization Service sent approved visas and sent them to 9/11 hijackers 6 months after the attacks had occurred. It showed just sort of how deficient the systems were across government to identify, trained operatives entering the United States and figure out how to respond to them. And since then, there've been dramatic changes where we've created a terrorist screening center. We have processes by which all information about terrorism are gathered into a specific database called TIDE, and then moved into watch lists through a series of nomination process. And that has made the government quite a bit more effective at making sure that information about terrorism is in the right place. And so the government has been sort of more effective in responding to threats we know and understand, threats like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But this remains, I think, a particularly concerning area. And we know there are more radicalized people in the world now than there were before 9/11. Terrorist deaths every year around the world are still much higher than they were in the period before those attacks. And there are new threats. These are threats like particularly right-wing extremism or white supremacist groups that are evolving and could evolve to look much more like what we've associated with groups like Al-Qaeda in the future. The kind of attacks they pursue. And this is something that is going to need to remain sort of top of mind if the government's going to effectively respond. So the next area I'll talk about, next emerging threat, is with organized crime. And this is a place where the government has not adapted as successfully as it has in terms of counterterrorism. I think this is a place where much more of a change is going to be needed in the structure and response in order to be more effective. Organized crime, particularly again in the 21st century, has become much, much more dangerous and has become much more well-resourced than the groups that existed in the 20th century and the groups for which we organized ourselves to respond. The United States law enforcement structure was very effective at responding to the mafia. Once it started to respond effectively, it was very effective, and is well organized to investigate groups domestically and respond to threats there. But it is very difficult for established organizations to deal with transnational criminal groups that have broad activities, that have lots of different revenue sources, and that have huge access to huge markets that make them incredibly potent and give them the ability to bring in enormous amounts of resources and apply serious challenges to even nation states in other places. And you see this particularly in Mexico and Central America, where there are where there are real challenges to state sovereignty from some of these groups. And so the response, the response the United States government has pursued has largely been this investigate, arrest, extradite, and try process, which is what we've seen. The been, even when we've had significant successes like the arrest of Chapo Guzman, they haven't fundamentally affected the ability of these organizations to operate. And we still see groups like the Sinaloa cartel are still nearly as threatening as they were a decade ago, despite these efforts. And so it's a place where the government strategy and structure are going to need to adapt in order to be effective. And with this, that the way the United States deals with organized crime is largely driven by the DEA, which it has been since the FBI sort of backed off from organized crime in the wake of 9/11 when they switched their new responsibilities. But this is something where the kinds of international partnerships that need to be in place and the kinds of resources that need to go to this are just fundamentally going to have to shift. So the next area I'll talk about quickly is natural disasters, and I think everyone sees the results of this, the escalating intensity of disasters. I know folks have some folks have experienced it in places like California and Oregon very recently with wildfires. This year we've had the fastest progress through named hurricanes in history. There's a second hurricane right now that looks like it's going to hit Central America in a very short period of time. The climate-driven changes that are causing a climate-driven escalation in natural disasters is something that is overwhelming the ability of governments to respond, and is going to change the way we need to think about natural disasters, because the federal role now is fundamentally in coordinating different resources and getting different resources that already exist to places where there are disasters to respond. And the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, does a good job coordinating across different parts of government, but it isn't fundamentally, and it's fundamentally taking resources that exist for other purposes and using them for disaster response. And increasingly what we're seeing is that there's going to have to be much more the kinds of resources that we normally associate with military actions are going to have to go into protecting civilians from disasters domestically, and also protecting civilians internationally. And this is, I think, a fundamental shift. There's also, FEMA is good at incident command and response, but it's not good at doing that when there are unresolved policy issues or when something is really novel. So, FEMA is fine if it's coordinating getting Coast Guard helicopters to respond to a hurricane in the Gulf or something, but it's not effective if you're dealing with a migration crisis on the border where there are still major security issues that, a migration crisis driven by a hurricane or something like that, where there are major policy issues that need to be addressed. And so the next area where the next sort of emerging threat, or this is a threat that's already emerged, people have been talking about this for decades, is clearly cybersecurity. The United States government, people have been talking about a cyber 9/11 since the immediate aftermath of 9/11, and before that they talked about a cyber Pearl Harbor. There's the Deputy Attorney General in the 90s was talking about this, and this. As we've moved to just all communication, all information being stored on digital systems that are subject to intrusion, there's been just sort of an endless parade of disasters and outrages can sort of become numb to. But there also hasn't been sort of 9/11 like incident that's really crystallized things in the public mind. And I suspect we will have those kinds of incidents as vulnerabilities grow and grow and grow, and how we have more and more intrusions. But it is just important not to downplay how bad some of the disasters have already happened, have been. So particularly things like the Equifax breach, which really stands out in its awfulness because of because most Americans whose information was breached didn't realize they weren't consenting directly to sharing information, their detailed credit history. And then on the government side, the government has been extremely negligent in protecting very, very important information. And this is something I've experienced personally. Is when I was in government, the Office of Personnel Management's computers in which they stored all of the information from people's security clearances, including my own, were hacked by, and it has been reported that were hackers related to the Chinese government. And it's as if all of us actually went through and applied for security clearances with the Chinese government and allowed them to interview all of our our friends and family under threat of perjury to ask about our lifestyles. I mean, it's just really crazy, and will have implications that could manifest for years and years into the future. But basically, the government has been so ineffective in responding to cybersecurity because it has treated it as a matter of intelligence competition with foreign governments. And the center of gravity in the United States has been always, and the center of gravity in the United States government for cybersecurity has been the National Security Agency, and then just the military as well, but the US Cyber Command and the National Security Agency are dual-hatted now. And it's always been focused on offensive operations. And so whenever there's been a whole series of different times when different presidents have said, this is crazy, we need some sort of cybersecurity strategy, we need to deal with these vulnerabilities, each time the response that comes back ends up being something about active defense. And we'll go out and we'll interdict threats, or we'll go and we'll do something offensive. And part of that is just sort of how, what these agencies do. The National Security Agency, of course, was created in the Cold War, and it's sort of the agency's sort of golden days were in intercepting communications from the Russian leadership, and that's what they want to keep doing. But they also are limited because they're intelligence agencies. They're not appropriate. They're not legally allowed to deal with domestic vulnerabilities and domestic systems. And so we have this situation where we keep putting resources in cybersecurity into agencies in the US government that can't actually deal with the direct vulnerabilities we have. And then the agencies that get put in charge of dealing with domestic vulnerabilities, whether it's the Department of Commerce, the National Institute of Standards, now the Department of Homeland Security, don't have resources and are seen as incompetent and then aren't able to actually address problems. So this is something that I think really is going to need to shift. There are going to need to be changes in the regulatory environment, and there's going to have to be, there's going to need to be some kind of reorganization of the government's functions of this to actually get resources where they need to be in order to effectively respond. And then the last area I'll talk about, and this is one that is unpleasant and is one that I think has a lot of associations with the Iraq War for people, because it was the justification for the Iraq War was so focused on weapons of mass destruction. But I think weapons of mass destruction is an area that needs much more attention from the national security community and leadership, and one where the United States government is not particularly well organized to respond to the kinds of threats that are emerging, where technological changes have made it much more possible that non-state actors could actually obtain and use a weapon that could go far beyond anything we've previously seen. So first, nuclear weapons technology is now 75 years old. The key barrier to proliferation, the key barrier to a terrorist or other non-state group using a nuclear weapon is in obtaining the fissile material. The technology involved in actually creating a weapon has just been totally overwhelmed by progress, and it's something that is not difficult for organizations to do. There was even in 1977 a Princeton undergraduate used publicly available sources to design a nuclear weapon, and then his work was later classified after the FBI investigated it. But I mean, if that was possible in 1977, there aren't serious barriers on it now. And nuclear material has not been secured to the extent that I think any of us would like to have it seen, especially during the fall of the Soviet Union. But then the other area that is I think even more alarming are the possibility of biological weapons. And the key thing to think about with biological weapons, and the thing that is most alarming about them, is the possibility of something infectious being intentionally designed. And this is something that hasn't occurred yet. And I think a lot of people, a lot of us, or certainly I had when I came into government, associate biological weapons with sort of these like Cold War, there's a laboratory somewhere in Siberia where they're, keeping smallpox samples or something. But it's something where the advances the advances in biotechnology have empowered very small organizations like companies to create things that go way beyond what even superpower funded laboratories could do during the Cold War. And the possibility particularly of some kind of very, very infectious, very dangerous disease being created by a small organization and then released is, I think, incredibly alarming, and one that isn't being treated with the kind of concern that would be appropriate to the scale of the threat. And particularly, information about these kind of things keeps getting published by organizations or journals, and very, very stuff that could be very very sensitive, is is made public by researchers in the name of research, and then there certainly are viable reasons for doing it, but they I think often not thinking through what the possible consequences could be. And so just a quick example of this is that Canadian researchers published a detailed explanation of how they'd assembled a smallpox-like virus using available DNA samples purchased over the internet. Stuff like this in the wrong hands is really kind of scary. And as we've seen, the U.S. government has a very difficult time responding to new, novel diseases. And so this is something that I think deserves a lot more public attention. So what are, as I've gone through this parade of horribles and described these things that I think are going to change government, what are the lessons then, and what are the sort of key takeaways as we think about DHS and what this means for this, and also why hasn't DHS fixed all of these? And so DHS has consolidated certain functions, but a lot of them, as I've described, still aren't something that's been effectively dealt with. We've certainly got a much more effective counterterrorism structure now than we had previously, but on a lot of these other things, cybersecurity, organized crime, et cetera, weapons of mass destruction, there haven't been the kinds of shifts that'd be necessary to really to really address the scale of the threat. And so, to me, the key lessons from this and from the experience of DHS and some of the disorganization around it are that we need to focus, as the public who's interested and as also officials who may be involved, we need to focus on managing this transition, where instead of where as government starts to do something new and as it creates new organizations and as it follows new strategies, we need to manage the process to make sure that there aren't overreaches, that there aren't abuses and other things, but that also that they're being effective and focusing on this new strategy. That anytime you're shifting things around in government, there are always opportunities for overreach, or fraud, waste, and abuse, things like that. And it also, at the same time, will be adapting legal structures. There will be either legal changes, or there will be shifts in the authorities that entities are using as they pursue new strategies to deal with things like cybersecurity or other threats that move across traditional boundaries. And this is difficult to manage, particularly when there's things like questions about privacy and how you reconcile sort of things that government needs to do with concerns about those things being invasive. Oversight, particularly congressional oversight, needs to balance concerns about incompetence and waste with the fundamental point about whether or not the new agencies are actually being, or new entities are being effective at their missions. And the easiest thing for overseers to do is always to find and punish incompetence. But I think that it's much more important to actually make sure that the strategies that entities are following are sound and get to where we want, than just finding places where someone has screwed up an acquisition procedure or something like that. And then for advocates, there's this I think that the focus really needs to be on, as the government adapts to this, not whether government is doing something new, but whether what they're doing is appropriate to the risk that they're trying to address, and whether there are appropriate protections in place to defend against abuse as they're doing this. And so with that, I'll stop, with that I'll conclude and say basically that that there is a point to DHS. People should broadly be interested in the lessons of the department. It really was the first sort of clumsy step in adapting the U.S. government security structure to these new non-state threats that we've gone through in detail. And that other parts of government are going to have to shift much like DHS. And so we really should think about this as we go through those processes, whether or not it's thoughtfully beforehand or whether it's in the aftermath of crises. Right.
So thank you so much, Ben, for that great presentation you outlined. I think we called it the parade of horrors or something like that, and then all the challenges that are going to be in place. A quick reminder for everyone, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A chat function. For now, I'll kick us off with the first question. So we're not that far past the election, and the Biden administration will take office in January. And throughout the presentation, you laid out the very real and serious national security threats that we're facing, and then the challenges and the things that any administration will have to be balancing to address these challenges. Do you see the Biden administration prioritizing the needed changes for addressing Homeland Security? And if so, what do you think will be the main challenges that they face as they move forward in implementing these types of needed changes?
Sure, thank you. I expect they will. Well, some more than others. I think that there are certain of these challenges that'll be sort of impossible to ignore. Of course, the biggest one is infectious disease. You know, I would expect major shifts in the way we respond to infectious disease. I would also expect that cybersecurity, if I was going to put money on sort of where the next big changes in government come, I would expect it would be in cybersecurity, as there's sort of these constant reminders of how vulnerable we are. But then the other piece, and this is, you know, sort of specific to the aftermath of the Trump administration, will be in sort of figuring out, because DHS was so focused on migration and there were so many abuses associated with it, how that process can be managed, how it can be sort of brought back to a place where everyone, you know, is more comfortable with, or what kind of shifts need to be made in dealing with that, and how they can reconcile with the problems that were pretty widespread.
Great, so we have some questions from the participants. The first question, kind of keeping with the same theme, is from Robert Bilgrad. And Robert asks, should a new organization be created to tackle pandemics, or simply bolstering the existing resources of the Center for Disease Control?
I would expect it'll go beyond just bolstering the CDC. I think so. The big place where we've seen a gap in, well, we've seen a lot of gaps in the U.S. government's pandemic response, but the place that I think has been most evident to everyone has been in vaccine development, where in World War II, in the aftermath of that, you had this vaccine development process that was really driven by the military, because we were stationing troops in places where they were getting diseases that they hadn't got previously. And so you had this coordinated effort where there were government resources and major companies working together and pushing out vaccines at a much faster rate than actually we've seen in recent decades. And in the last sort of 80s, 90s, early 2000s, we've seen is that a lot of major companies actually moved out of vaccine development. It's mostly these startups, and you're seeing that now, right? You're seeing either startups partnering with established medical companies. And the U.S. government also moved most of its funding for vaccines into research. So it's all through the National Institute of Health, where they research things, but then they wouldn't actually do what the government used to do, where they take things all the way through manufacture and delivery, which is what the U.S. military used to do, as it was more involved in it. So I suspect what you'll see is a much more aggressive federal role in sort of vaccines through the initial research all the way to manufacturing development and through distribution and deployment, which doesn't exist now, and which I think Operation Warp Speed has sort of gotten to. But I think that process in particular is going to fundamentally change, or needs to fundamentally change.
Great, so the next question is from Craig Campbell, who asks, why not rename Homeland Security and Safety, or Homeland Safety and Security, so rename DHS?
Yeah, I certainly get those points. You know, the Canadian equivalent is the Department of Public Safety. You know, there are, and I think certainly people associate DHS with this sort of, you know, post 9/11 chauvinism of like the Patriot Act, right? I would say, I mean, you can rename the department. This is sort of what we've got, you know, and I suspect that as we shift, as we start to shift other resources, there will be other entities that will also be involved in public safety. So, you know, you certainly can make a compelling case for changing the department's name. It's not something that I've focused on.
All right, another question from Theodore Eismeyer. My sense of the history is that DHS was thrown together. Would it benefit from reorganization?
So it could. I mean, there are pieces that are not in DHS that I think pretty obviously should. The most clear is the immigration courts. You know, most of the immigration functions are within DHS, but the immigration courts are within the Department of Justice. You can also make a case that consular affairs, which is in the Department of State, should have been part of the department. And then you can make a case that things like the Secret Service, Dignitary Protection Mission doesn't have a lot of connection to other things. So yeah, I think there's a certain amount of shifting that I think will make sense, and I suspect in the but I would say that rather than just think about changing stuff that's in DHS, I would say think about these vulnerabilities, these threats we've talked through today, and how government could actually be structured to effectively deal with those. So then instead of just thinking about whether the cybersecurity group should be moved to a different part of DHS, and where should the US government cybersecurity functions be and how should those be organized? And I would suggest that it's best to approach it that way rather than just like the organizational problems of DHS, which are significant.
I'm going to keep us on the DHS reorganization topic for one more question. This one is from Emma Israel, and she asks, are there ways that DHS can be restructured to either separate the immigration functions from the rest of the agency or otherwise change to somehow shield the work of the non-immigration functions from those that are more controversial pieces of the agency? Do you think there is value in that?
Yeah, the thing that I think folks that gets talked about most in this context is moving FEMA out so that you would have this disaster response not getting sucked into this controversy around immigration. At the same time, though, FEMA, a lot of the stuff that they deploy are from other federal law enforcement agencies, and Customs and Border Protection is the largest federal law enforcement agency. The Coast Guard, certainly, which is not part of DHS, provides a lot of that. So you certainly can. I think that the thing to consider whenever you're doing that is if you're going to move stuff out, what cabinet secretary will they report to? And what will that mean? I think, in the aftermath of all of the Trump administration, folks have talked about disbanding DHS, and that's fine. But if you're talking about going back to what existed previously, that would mean that the immigration functions would be in the Department of Justice. And so, who's the Attorney General? What does that mean? Who are they under? So if we're going to move certain functions out of DHS, are we going to put them under another cabinet secretary, which then creates another cabinet, and then there's all the attendant bureaucracy that goes around that. And then that's an even newer and more immature agency than DHS. I think we should just be careful about how we do that. But I mean, I think it could be a compelling point.
All right, so actually we're on the same theme for one more question, and you may have already covered some of this, but perhaps you have a few new points to add. This question is from Peter Cleaves. It is, challenges are pandemic, cybersecurity, non-state actors, the borders, climate. How can one organization handle this enormous range? Would it not be better to convert Homeland Security to a small agency with authority to monitor, assemble, and react, mobilizing assets of each department, and send the Homeland Security personnel back to their original departments?
I think the answer to that is probably no. So if you send Homeland Security personnel back to the original departments, you're sending immigration back to the Department of Justice, and then some of the border stuff back to agriculture. You're sending customs back to Treasury. You're still, and then if you had this sort of small DHS that was like this coordinating function, you still have the problem of getting all these different entities to do something coherently. I mean, I think it would actually create bigger coordination problems because you'd have, all right, at this port, we want to pursue some certain policy, and we need to get the folks who work for Justice, the folks who work for Treasury, the folks who work for Agriculture to all agree on what they're doing. DHS is unwieldy and difficult to manage, but it does at least report to a single secretary. If you have in government, when you talk about cross-cutting coordination functions like that, if it's going to be effective, what you're essentially talking about is the White House and having a White House entity doing it, because those are the only ones who can really bring together all of the agencies and force them to do things that they might not want to do. So, I think we have seen and can expect to see a larger role for like the National Security Council and all of this, but I don't think that some other coordinating entity located outside of the White House would be able to be very effective.
On the topic of coordination, Jaime Cabrera asks, what is the level of coordination that exists between DHS and other agencies, local and federal, to address internal threats like domestic terrorism? Should DHS lead in this field?
And some things, I mean, so DHS does a lot of local and federal coordination, and they have lots of things like fusion centers and other entities that are set up for them to work with locals. A lot of the terrorism stuff is led by the FBI and Joint Terrorism Task Forces, and they're going to maintain sort of primacy on the counterterrorism mission in terms of investigating things domestically. And so, DHS is a part of that, not necessarily the lead. But this question of how you coordinate between law enforcement at a local or state level and government is very significant, and one where there are a lot of challenges in the federal government because you have entities in DHS, you have entities in the Department of Justice, you have it very much spread out. DHS is not an interior ministry where all of the federal law enforcement is in one place. So, they do a lot. It is, however, very unwieldy, and the structures that are in place really vary. Sometimes fusion centers are very effective, and sometimes they're just like a bunch of people sitting in a room. So it's something that I think requires constant work.
All right, so a question from Donald Baldwin. Is legislation needed to enable the federal government to exercise more central control for pandemics versus the current state responsibilities?
Yeah, they'd need, they would actually need structural changes. I mean, so it depends on what the federal government would do in during pandemics. But if you have more resources going to the federal government, or the federal government able to apply more resources more directly, that would certainly require significant changes. If you were, right now, as we've seen, and there are these coronavirus task force meetings or other things, there's like lots of different people who end up being in charge. If you were going to put someone at a cabinet level in charge of this, there would need to be structural changes in order for them to really be in charge. Right now, it's maybe the Secretary of Health and Human Services, but they have a lot of other responsibilities too. So I think absolutely it will need it would need structural change, and I think we can expect structural change once we sort of get out of the woods here.
Great, so just a reminder, if anyone has questions, to leave them in the Q&A function. And on to a question from Adriana Mendez, who asks, what steps can the US begin taking to better tackle the rising concerns of cybersecurity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there are a few sort of essential pieces. So first, the United States is going to have to shift resources out of sort of purely offensive cyber or the kinds of military intelligence cyber that have dominated where resources have gone in the past. I think things like whether it's going to be in DHS or whether it's going to be somewhere else, there need to be entities with real resources focused on domestic cyber vulnerabilities. Second, there are almost inevitably going to be regulatory changes. Right now, almost all of the regulatory cooperation with the private sector is based on voluntary compliance with different standards. And I suspect that is going to be untenable. It works if you have well-resourced companies that have interests in protecting your systems as well. But if there are issues with viability of companies, as we saw with Yahoo, right? It's a company that used to have everyone's information and was, well-resourced for a really long time, and then suddenly wasn't, and then was not protecting this incredibly sensitive information. There's going to have to be something to deal with that. I suspect that it won't happen in the near term because everyone's going to be so focused on social media and sort of the aftermath of the election that a lot of these bigger cyber questions will get kicked down the road.
All right, and a question from Craig Campbell, who asks, why no focus on white-collar crime?
That is that's a major problem. I sort of for the threats that I'm describing here. So certainly a lot of organized crime is what we'd call white collar crime, or is involved in that, especially when you get into money laundering and sort of these movements, these international financial movements. To me, at least in the way I analyze things here, that the systemic risks come from these well-resourced transnational organizations that are able to conduct activities that previously, and apply resources that previously, only existed in a state context. So those are things like, cartels moving narcotics and being able to challenge government authorities that are responding to them, or things like cyber criminals who are suddenly able to steal huge amounts of money around the world, are a fundamentally new phenomenon, and something that really strains existing structures. White collar crime, I mean, that's obviously a very broad category, but to the extent it includes things like that, yes, to the extent it's other things that maybe aren't quite as this level of systemic risks, I think would fall outside that category, and probably could be dealt with by existing entities if they were focused on that.
Great, and I want to circle back with another question of my own, to take you in kind of a different area. In your book, you have a discussion about how political discussions around Homeland Security are pretty terrible and how they can sometimes be really divorced from the issues that they're supposed to be talking about. And now we live in an era where disinformation, misinformation can be spread so quickly. I mean, we see it play out all the time on social media. So how do you see this evolving in the coming years while we're trying to have smart discussions around Homeland Security issues, but you have this barrage of fake information also kind of flowing through the same channels?
Yeah, I think it's it's a very good point, and it's incredibly concerning, especially when you start to see leaders or people in administrations responding to that kind of information, and starting to be sort of part of that world and responding to those incentives. I think these questions about Homeland Security and these questions about the security functions of our government and how we're going to need to shift them are ones that need broad participation and ones where people need to be seriously focused on these vulnerabilities. But sort of to an earlier point, if we try to have a discussion about cyber and the discussion is all about whether or not Twitter is censoring conservatives, or whether they're these sort of politicized pieces of much larger issues end up dominating the discussion, we won't make the kinds of changes that need to be made, or we won't make the sort of serious kinds of shifts that need to be in place. And I think that that'll be bad. We will continue to see these vulnerabilities growing. And then the result, though, is going to be what we saw with DHS and what we're going to see now with this, which is there's going to be a disaster, and we're going to suddenly start shifting things around in the aftermath of a disaster. And that's regrettable, but I think that is the direction we will go in if we don't have a serious discussion about these in advance.
Great. So I think there's one other question that just came in. It's from Gabrielle Cahiga. Sorry if I pronounced your last name wrong. I'm sure I did. The question is, should Congress give DHS general authority to regulate critical infrastructure entities for cybersecurity?
I think there should be changes to the way that cyber critical infrastructure is regulated. Whether DHS could handle that now with their existing staff, I think it's part of this question of right now DHS, their cybersecurity functions are organized to do with voluntary compliance, helping set standards, helping provide information, helping alert companies about breaches and things like that. But so I think the answer is basically yes, but it would need to be part of this bigger shift in how we deal with cybersecurity. We can't have it's like, well, DHS does voluntary compliance, and then the FBI, they're going to investigate things, and then maybe they'll indict some hackers who live in Romania, and that'll be the end of it. Or then separately, the NSA is going to do active defense and a bunch of stuff that is top secret and you don't need to know about, and that's it, that's done. I think we're going to need a much more coherent strategy, a way to actually regulate cyber infrastructure, and a serious change in the way that government and industry work together on this, and the way requirements are enforced.
Great. And so we just got a question that's very similarly related from Robert Bilgrad. And the question is, yes, we could be facing increases in cyber attacks, but not necessarily in a vacuum. Biological attacks, terrorist attacks are also occurring. How would we organize to effectively face multifaceted attacks?
I think those all require different responses, right? So if you have the changes we need to make, I think you need to focus on vulnerabilities. So if you're going to deal with cyber vulnerabilities, there are a series of steps you need to take to improve our cyber infrastructure, change the way we deal with industry and government, and actually close up those vulnerabilities. But for example, terrorists and weapons of mass destructions, there's a different set of vulnerability. So example, a terrorist nuclear weapon. If terrorists were going to bring a nuclear weapon into the United States, they would bring it in a cargo container, they would bring it on a small boat, they would bring it on general aviation. Like those are the sort of things that are most concerning. There might be other ways, but those are basically the big categories. And for all three of those, we don't have a way to scan them for radiation before they arrive in the United States. Planes aren't checked in foreign airports. We don't check cargo containers until they're brought into physical ports in the United States. And the extent we do some scanning of small craft that arrive, most of our work to deal with small boats is to find stop go fast boats that are filled with cocaine coming up to Florida. And so those are big problems, and they need to be addressed, and they need a specific sort of set of steps to deal with. Same thing with biological weapons. And biological weapons, that would be part of sort of the public health response to, part of the public health response to pandemics. But there's a series of steps that you need to take, identifying them and having research moving on potential vaccines for the most likely candidates for diseases that could be turned into biological weapons, things like that. There's a bunch of steps you do. So I think you need to focus on where the vulnerabilities are and how you respond to those different categories.
Great, and the next question comes from Natalia Zamora Garcia, who asks, how can DHS enhance its capacity to anticipate, identify, and respond to new or emerging weapons of mass destruction threats?
It could enhance it quite a bit. Yeah, DHS's capacity, its intelligence capacity, is largely, it synthesizes intelligence that's gathered by other entities. There is a countering weapons of mass destruction office within DHS, but it's part of the organization that is not comparatively as well funded, and they'll focus on creating some new radiation detector or something else. I think fundamentally that most of the DHS strategy in this area was put in place after 9/11, or put in place when the department was established in the first years, 2003 through 2007, 2008, where people were really aggressively trying to figure this out. And they were doing things like trying to put inspections in foreign ports and being really aggressive with foreign governments in order to get them to do this. And a lot of that's calmed down sort of in the aftermath. And the result is we've got, there hasn't been as much progress recently in these areas because they don't get as much attention because they're these lower probability but higher consequence events. And so I think I think there should be a much more aggressive effort, but it should be focused on the possibility of smuggled nuclear weapons anywhere, and biological and also chemical weapons in particular. But there are a lot of steps that could be taken, a lot more resources that could go into this than that are going now. It's just not what the government has prioritized the same way we've prioritized other things.
All right, so I think we've gone through almost all of the questions. And we're almost out of time, so I will take the liberty of asking the last question. And on the theme of the Central American Mexico Policy Initiative, I wanted to take you a little bit to DHS abroad and thinking about the idea of Homeland Security within the region. And in your book, you write that DHS has more day-to-day interactions with Canada and Mexico than any other US federal department. Do you think that we should be viewing Homeland Security in a more regional perspective?
Yeah, thank you. I absolutely do. And I think that the kinds of international partnerships and collaborations that we have relied on for sort of our previous security and foreign policy priorities are going to be more and more ill-suited to these kind of threats I've described. And what will become more and more important will be these sort of functional partnerships where we are dealing with counterparts on specific issues, and where we're putting maybe people in the United States government who probably wouldn't have been involved in foreign interactions in the past, much more directly engaged with foreign counterparts. And so just examples will be, obviously North America, the US government working directly with Canada and Mexico, but there should be all kinds of direct connections between counterparts, where rather than going through the embassy and then having that come back to the government and going through the capitals, the Commissioner of Customs in Mexico will just talk directly to the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection in the US, things like that. And another example will be groups like the Five Eyes, so the United States, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand, which started as an intelligence sharing partnership, but then has expanded out where now their heads of migration meet, or now their heads of customs meet, where you have these international entities that have similar interests, and then you start combining entities by function. And I think those kind of groups and those kind of partnerships are going to become much, much more important and be expanded to deal sort of with these specific issues.
Ben, thank you so much for this great presentation and discussion. Everyone check out Ben's book. I can't hold it up, it doesn't really show up, but it's more or less afraid of nearly everything. And thank you all so much for joining us today. This concludes our event, and I hope you all have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everybody. It was a pleasure.